Բարև ձեզ հարգելի գործընկերներ, շնորհակալություն մեր հրավերը
Good afternoon,
ընդունելու
dear
համար։
colleagues. Thank you
Մենք
for accepting our
հրապարակել ենք
invitation. We
հրաֆինանսավորման
have published
տոկոսադրույքը բարձրացվել է
new
մինչև 9.25%։
refinancing
Պարոն
raised it
Գալստյանը
to
կներկայացնի մամուլի հաղորդագրությունը,
9.25.
որից
Mr.
հետո
Galstyan
կարող եք
will
հարցեր
read
ուղղել։
out for you the press release and we'll accept questions.
Բարև ձեզ։
Good afternoon.
2022 թվականի մարտի
On
15-ին
March
Կենտրոնական բանկի խորհուրդը
15-22,
որոշեց
the CBA
բարձրացնել
board decided to raise the refinancing rate by 1.25 percentage points, setting it at 9.25%.
թվականի փետրվարին
In February
եւ 12
2022,
ամսյա եւ բնականոն
both the
գնաճը
12-month and the natural inflation
համահունչ նվազել
fell
են
in line with the
եւ կազմել
expectations and
համապատասխանաբար
projections of the Central Bank of Armenia, totaling 6.5 and 6.4% respectively. In the external sector, in the context of the Russian-Ukrainian military conflict, various sanctions have been imposed upon Russia's economy. As a result, a significant increase in financial market volatility and uncertainty about economic prospects was observed.
ԱՄՆ-ում եւ
In the United
Եվրոպայում
States
ընթացիկ
and the
տարում
Eurozone,
կանխատեսվում է տնտեսական աճի
the
տեմպերի
slowdown of
դանդաղում,
economic growth is expected this year, and economic decline is expected in Russia.
միաժամանակ
At
մատակարարման
the same time, the
շղթաների
disruption of the
դիտարկող
reviewed supply chains
միջազգային
in
ապրանքային
the
շուկաներում
international
առաջացրել են
commodity and
գների
food
զգալի
markets
աճ։
have caused a significant
Սա
increase in
արտահայտվում է
prices.
գործընկեր երկրներում
This is
սպասվածի
reflected in the
համեմատ ավելի
formation
բարձր
of higher
գնաճային
than
միջավայրի
expected
ձևավորմամբ։
inflationary environment in partner countries.
Արդյունքում
As a
արտաքին
result,
հատվածից
a
Հայաստանի
mainly
Հանրապետության
inflationary
տնտեսության
impact is expected
ակնկալվում է
on the
հիմնականում
Armenian economy
գնաճային
from the
ազդեցություն։
external sector.
Ռուսաստանի դեմ
The
կիրառված
impact of
պատժամիջոցների
sanctions imposed
ազդեցությունը
upon
Հայաստանի
Russia
տնտեսության
will be
վրա
reflected
կարտահայտվի
in the
տնտեսական
significant
աճի տեմպերի զգալի
slowdown of economic
դանդաղմամբ։
growth in Armenia.
Սա առավելապես
This
տեղի
will be
կունենա
mostly
արդյունաբերության ճյուղի
conditioned by
անկման հաշվին։
the industrial
Ամբողջական պահանջարկի վրա
decline.
կկրի
Total
դրամական
demand will
փոխանցումների
be affected
նվազման
by
եւ
declining
արտաքին
remittances
պահանջարկի
and
թուլացման
sluggish
ազդեցությունները։
external demand.
Զբոսաշրջության
A
ոլորտից
positive
սպասվում է
contribution is
դրական նպաստ։
expected from the tourism sector.
Տարածաշրջանի աշխարհաքաղաքական
Growing
ռիսկերի ավելացումը եւ
geopolitical risks in
բարձր
the region
անորոշությունը
and the high
հանգեցրել է
uncertainty
ՀՀ ֆինանսական
have led to
շուկաներում
increased volatility
տատանողականության
in the
աճի
Armenian financial
եւ ռիսկի
markets
հավելավճարի
and bigger
մեծացման։
risk premium.
Արտա
As a
անորոշությունները
consequence, the
արտահայտվել են
existing
նաև գնաճի եւ
uncertainties were
գնաճային
reflected in
սպասումների
the inflation
վարկագծում։
dynamics and inflation
Ստեղծված
expectations as
իրավիճակում
well.
խորհուրդը
In view of the
նպատակահարմար է
above,
գտնում
the board of the
համապատասխան մեծ քայլով
CBA judges
բարձրացնել
it appropriate to
վերաֆինանսավորման
increase the refinancing
տոկոսադրույքը։
rate by a relatively
Խորհուրդը
large
գնահատում է,
step.
որ տնտեսական
The board
հեռանկարի հետ կապված անորոշության եւ
evaluates that
գնաճային
amid economic
սպասումների
outlook
ավելացման ռիսկերի պահպանման
uncertainties
դեպքում
and
առաջիկայումս
provided the risks of rising
կդիտարկվի,
inflation expectations persist,
դրամարկային
the need for
պայմանների
possible
հնարավոր
tightening of
խստացման
monetary conditions in
անհրաժեշտությունը։
the near future will be considered as
Քաղաքականության
well.
նման
Due
գործողությունների
to this
արդյունքում
policy
12 ամսյա
actions,
գնաճն
12-month
աստիճանաբար
inflation will
կնվազի
gradually
եւ
decrease
կանխատեսվող
and reach
հորիզոնում
the
կմոտենա
target
նպատակային 4%
of
ցուցանիշին։
4% in the forecast
Կենտրոնական բանկի
horizon.
խորհուրդը
The
գնահատում
board
է,
of the
որ
central bank
աշխարհաքաղաքական
considers that as a
զարգացումներով
result of
պայմանավորված
geopolitical developments, the
մակրոտնտեսական
uncertainty in
հեռանկարի հետ
terms of
կապված
macroeconomic
անորոշությունը էականորեն
perspective
ավելացել է։
has significantly expanded.
Միաժամանակ
At the
կանխատեսված
same time,
ուղեկից
the
գնաճի
risks of
շեղման ռիսկերը
inflation
հիմնականում
deviation from the projected
հավասարակշռված են։
trajectory are mainly
Ռիսկերի որևէ
balanced.
ուղղությամբ դրսևորման
Should the risk
պարագայում
materialize in
խորհուրդը
any
համարժեքորեն
direction, the board
կարձագանքի
stands ready
եւ
to respond accordingly
կապահովի գների
in
կանոնության
fulfillment of the price
նպատակը։
stability objective. Thank you for your attention. Arca.
Գործակալություն
Arca
ինչքան է
agency.
հիմա կենտրոնական
What is
բանկի
the central bank's
կանխատեսումը
projection
հնայի
at this
վերաբերյալ
point about the GDP, annual GDP?
Այսպիսի հարց միջազգային կառույցների կամ պետությունների
The
կողմից ճնշում
international
գործադրվում է
organizations or
արդյոք
states, do they
ԿԲ-ի վրա
exercise any
Ռուսաստանի դեմ
pressure over the Central
ֆինանսաբանկային
Bank of Armenia
պատժամիջոցներին
to join
միանալու
in the bandwagon
համատեքստում
of financial
Եվս
sanctions
մի հարց
against the Russian
թույլտվությամբ
Federation?
հայկական
And with your
բանկերը
permission, another
խնդիրներ ունեն վիզա,
question: Do
մաստերկարդ եւ
Armenian
վճարային
banks encounter
համակարգերի
any
հետ
problems with
կապված
Visa,
ինչպիսին
MasterCard,
են
or other
խնդիրները,
payment
եթե կան
systems?
եւ
If
ինչ
yes,
մեխանիզմներով
what are
են
those
լուծվում։
objectives and what are
Եվ
the
որպես հարցի
proposed
շարունակություն
solutions? Picking
ԿԲ-ն
up with the
մտադիր
same
է
question, does the CBA
սերտիֆիկացնել
intend
որևէ
to
վճարային համակարգ
certify
օրինակ
any other
բանկերը կարող են ինքնուրույն
payment
այդ
systems, for example,
գործընթացով զբաղվել,
UniPay?
գիտենք,
Can the
որ հիմա
banks
սպասարկում կա, բայց
individually do
քարտեր
this
չեն
on their own? We
տրամադրվում։
know they're servicing
Եվ
these,
ընդհանրապես
but do
Հայաստանի
not issue
դառնաժեշտ է,
cards. Does
շնորհակալություն։
Armenia need it at all to begin with? Thank you.
Փորձենք հերթով։
We'll try to
Նախ
the questions in
թույլտվեք միջև ձեր
succession.
հարցերին
With your
պատասխանելը
permission, before answering the
ես
questions,
մեր թիմին
I
շնորհակալություն
would like to
հայտնեմ,
thank our
նաև ինձ
team
ձեր անունից, որովհետև
on your behalf as
այսօրվա
well.
խոսակցությունը
I believe
հնարավոր
because
չէր լինի
today's
ունենալ, եթե
conversation
մեր
would
թիմը
not have been
չլիներ
possible had our
պրոֆեսիոնալ
team
են
been
մակարդակի
professional
ունեցվածության են մակարդակի
and
որով կա։
dedicated to the extent
Մենք
that
այսօր
it
կարողանում
is.
ենք ձեզ թվեր
We
ներկայացնել
are
մեր
able to
իրավիճակում
report
տոտալ անորոշության
statistics
մեջ,
in
իսկ տոտալ
total
անորոշության մեջ ինչ որ բանի
uncertainty.
շուրջ
talking about
թվային
something
արտահայտությամբ
in
խոսելը իմ
digits,
պատկերացմամբ այսօրվա
in total
դրությամբ հերոսություն է։
uncertainty, if you want my opinion,
Հենց որ
is
կարծում
heroic
եմ, որ
as of
ներկայացված
today.
սլայդերը
So I
նայելուց
believe
գնահատեք
once you
կատարված
look at the
աշխատանքը։
slides, you will be
Հիմա ինչ վերաբերում է
able to
ձեր
evaluate
հարցին
the work
տնտեսական
done.
աճի հետ
As
կապված
for
սլայդի
your
վրա դուք տեսնում եք, որ մեր
question on economic growth, you see
կանխատեսումները
on this
նախկին
slide that
5.3-ի
our
փոխարեն
projections instead of
իջեցվել են մինչև
5.3 have been
1.6%։
reduced to
Ես
1.6.
ինչպես մամլո հաղորդագրության մեջ
As I
նշեցի,
mentioned in
հիմնականում
the press release, this
դա
is
պայմանավորված
mainly
է
determined
արդյունաբերության
by
ճյուղի
industrial
զարգացումներով։
developments in the industry.
Եթե 4G կա միացած, խնդրում ենք անջատել,
If someone has a 4G turned on, please turn it off and join the Wi-Fi of the central bank. Thank you.
Դուք տեսնում եք, որ արդյունաբերության ճյուղում որոշակի նվազում ունենք,
There
մենք
is certain
կանխատեսում ենք, որ
decline in the
արդյունաբերության
industry.
ճյուղը
We
պիտի
estimate that
22
the
թվականի
industry
ընթացքում աճեր
should have grown by
1.6%-ով,
1.6
այնինչ նոր
through
զարգացումների
2022,
ներքո,
whereas
երբ
in
մենք
view of the new
տեսնում ենք, որ կան
developments,
որոշակի
we see
խնդիրներ
that
հանք
there are certain
արդյունաբերությունում,
challenges in
մշակող
the mining,
արդյունաբերությունում,
in the
արդյունաբերության
processing
ճյուղի
industry.
-4.7%
Minus 4.7 is
որոշակի
the
նվազում
growth.
կա նաև
There is
շինարարության
a certain
ճյուղում,
decline in
տեսնեք, որ
construction as
այդտեղ
well.
եթե
You
բանին
will
նայեք
see that if you
գրաֆիկին
look
ձախ
at the
կողմում,
graph
տեսնեք,
on
որ
the left-hand
միակը,
side,
որը
you
որ
see
որոշակի
that
ավելի դրական
the
զարգացում
only
ունենալու
one with
մեր
a
նախկին
certain positive
կանխատեսումների համաձայն դա
increase
գյուղատնտեսության ճյուղն է։
compared to our projections is
Ինչ
agriculture.
վերաբերում է
As
ձեր
for
երկրորդ հարցին,
your second
արդյոք
question as to whether
ճնշումներ կան մեզ
there are
վրա,
any pressures
ըստ էության
exercised upon
մեր
us,
մոտեցումը հետևյալն
essentially
է,
our
որ մենք
approach is
հետևելու
as
ենք
follows. We
միջազգային
will
սանկցիաների
monitor
ռեժիմին,
the regime of
ունենք
international
դրա որոշակի
sanctions.
փորձ
We
նաև,
have
ու
certain
կարծում ենք,
experience
որ մեր
already
այսօրվա
of doing
առաքելության
that.
հիմնական
I think
նպատակը
the main
Հայաստանի
purpose of
ֆինանսական
our mission
համակարգը
today
անաղարտ
is
պահելու
to
մեջ է կայանում։
keep the Armenian financial
Երրորդ
system
հարցը
immune. Third question.
Վիզա մաստեր
Visa
ունենք
and
մեկ
Master
օրինակ,
card.
որտեղ
We have one
խնդիր ունենք,
case
որովհետև
with
բանկն է
the issue
գտնվում
since the bank
սանկցիոն
itself is
ցուցակում,
in the
մնացած
sanctions
դեպքերում
list.
որևէ խնդիր չկա։
In all other cases, there's no
Իրանք
issue
բնականոն
whatsoever.
ընթացքով սպասարկվում են
They-
երկու համակարգն է Հայաստանի
Both
բոլոր
systems
մնացած
are
բանկերի
naturally
կողմից։
serviced by all remaining banks in
Union Pay-ի
Armenia.
հետ այս
As for
պայդրությամբ
Union Pay,
կդժվարանամ կոնկրետ
at this point,
պատասխան տալ,
it's hard
որովհետև
for
դրա
me to
համավարկային
answer
նիստա,
specifically because
բայց
there is
ամեն
a session
դեպքում
of
կա
the
ինքը, եթե ես չեմ սխալվում, մեր ԱԳԲ բանկը
monetary
համաձայնագիր
system.
ունի,
If I'm not mistaken,
բայց
our
արդյոք
AGBA
քարտերը
bank has an
Հայաստանում գործում
agreement
են, թե չէ
whether
ձեզ
the
հետո
cards
գրավոր առանձին
operate in Armenia or not.
տեղեկացնեք։
We will inform you in writing
Sputnik,
subsequently.
Sputnik հետո 160
Sputnik then 168.
Մի բան եմ ուզում տնտեսական աճի կանխատեսման հետ
About the
կապված
economic
ավելացնել
growth
հնայի
projection.
աճը, երբ որ մենք կանխատեսել
When
ենք,
we
մենք ըստ էության
project
հարկաբյուջետային
the growth
քաղաքականությունը վերցրել ենք այն, ինչ որ ենթադրվում էր
we
մինչև
took
շոկը,
the fiscal policy
հետևաբար
to be the
կախված
same
նաև
as
թե դա
before the
ինչպես
shock. So
կփոփոխվի,
depending on
այսինքն
how
եթե
it
օրինակ
will
հարկաբյուջետային
mutate,
քաղաքականությունը շոկի
if the
արդյունքում կլինի
fiscal
ավելի
policy as a
խթանող
result of
կամ
the shock
հակառակը,
becomes more incentivizing or
նույն
the
կերպ
other
նաև
way
դա
around,
կարտացոլվի հնայի
it
մեջ,
will
ուզում եմ շեշտադրել, որ
respectively
այս
be
հնայի
reflected in the
կանխատեսման մեջ
GDP. So I
հարկաբյուջետային
want to
քաղաքականության
emphasize
փոփոխություն
that
դեռևս
we have not
արտացոլված
yet
չէ։
factored in fiscal policy changes in this projection of the GDP.
Շնորհակալություն։
Thank you.
Բանկերը մի շարք բանկեր հաղորդագրություն
A
են
number of
տարածել,
banks have
զգուշացնելով
circulated
չօգտվել
warnings
այդ սանկցիաների ներքո հայտնված ռուսական բանկերից, որպես
the services of Russian banks
միջնորդ
under the
բանկ ամեն
sanctions
դոլարով
as
խնդիրներ
intermediaries
կատարելիս,
to
ազգային
get
բանկը եւ այլ բանկեր։
wire
Արդյոք
transfers
մեծ է, որքան է, այսինքն այդ գործակների
US
տեսակարար
dollars.
կշիռը ընդհանուր
What's the
դոլարի
share
փոխանցումների մեջ,
of
այսինքն
these
կամ
types
գոնե
of
դրանք էական
transactions
են
in
թե
the
ոչ,
total
եւ
dollar
եթե
wire
միջնորդ
transfer?
բանկը
Is it significant or not?
տեղափոխվում է այլ
And if
դեպի այլ
any
բանկ
of the
կամ այլ
banks
յուրիսդիկցիա, դա
is
արդյոք այդ
moving to
տրանզակցիոն
another
ծախքերը բարձրացնում
intermediary
է
bank or jurisdiction, will that increase transactional costs
կախված
or not?
ձեռնարկությունների վճարունակության
Depending on the
հետ
solvency
արդյոք
of
ունեք որևէ
the
գնահատական թե
enterprises. Do you have an estimate of the
ունեք
solvency
արտանող ձեռնարկությունները դեպի
station
Ռուսաստան, եթե
of the situation of the
նրանք
enterprises, if those
ստանան
who are exporting to Russia?
այդ պայմանագրային եկամուտները կամ հասույթը
Will they be
վաճառքներից Ռուսաստանում
receiving
ռուսական ռուբլով եւ դրամային
their
արտահայտությամբ
accounts
նրանց
receivables
հասույթը նվազի,
in Russian
արդյոք
rubles
նրանք կարող
and
են
in drams their
խնդիրներ
revenue
ունենալ
will thus decrease? Will they
որպես
encounter
պատկառող։
problems as
Այսօր
borrowers
քանի
or
որ մենք
not?
բացառիկ իրավիճակում
Since
ենք,
we
միայն
are in an
գրամավարկայինով ոնց որ թե
exceptional
չենք
situation today,
սահմանափակվել, ունենց որ
will
փորձեմ
not
հակիրճ նայել
limit
անդրադառնալ ձեր
ourselves
այլ
to just
հարցերին։
monetary issues. I will try to
Բանկերի
briefly
տրանզակցիոն
reflect on your
ծախքերի
other
հետ
questions.
կապված
As
մենք մեր
for
վերջին
transactional costs encountered by the banks in the wake of our recent meeting when there were already discussions about certain tensions or possible sanctions. We did some homework with our banking system to diversify their corresponding account prospects and scope. At this point in time, this work is still underway, so our expectation is that eventually we will succeed to diversify the corresponding accounts of our banking system to the extent that there will be no significant increase in transactional costs. As for our exporters to the Russian Federation, their behavior or accounts receivable and the impact on their solvency, at this point this would require some micro-analysis. At this point in time, I will not claim that we are fully in control of the situation. It's quite a patchwork. There are companies that have contracts designated in US dollars, but in their subsequent contracts they are expected to be in Russian rubles. There are companies that at this point expect to be paid in Russian rubles, and naturally this will have a significant impact. The ruble-dollar or ruble-dram exchange will significantly impact them as of the point of transaction. And there are companies who negotiate with suppliers to just get their receivables, because there are some issues there as well. We need to understand the overall risk or exposure of the banking sector to this type of companies, and after certain analysis we'll be able to summarize. I cannot tell you about the risks accumulated at this point, but total weight of exports to Russia is $850 million. Only part of it is agricultural produce. There is also processing industries who do not have serious impediments in servicing their debt. So once we do this analysis, we'll share the findings with you, understanding the degree of risk. Do you have analysis or observations about whether their suppliers have hiked the prices in rubles to catch up with the decline of ruble vis-à-vis the dollar? Unfortunately, Aramjan, at this point, the uncertainty is so high that everyone is still on standby, waiting to see when this confrontation active phase will be over, after which new economic realities will settle and new negotiations will therefore commence. Let me fill in, as the governor mentioned, renegotiating is what exporters are actively engaged in. As for importers, there is less of uncertainty because the main goods imported are in dollars, and there is significantly less uncertainty here, which is why the main question is how will our exporters renegotiate. With importers, there's far less issues. 168 hours. Mr. Galstyan, I would like to say whether there is a danger of forex flight, and if yes, will the central bank impose any restrictions on acquiring hard currency? And the next question today, in lawyer Rafi Aslanyan disseminated news about Econom Bank affiliated with Khachatur Sukyasyan refusing to return long-term deposits or pay interest on citizens in their dollar deposits. Do you see an issue there, and does central bank have anything to do here? As for flight of forex and restrictions on it, there is no need for it at this point. I know there are countries that have imposed certain restrictions on taking cash forex out. Our partners in the banking system have already offered certain solutions to this, but for central bank to impose any directives to regulate the situation, I do not see the need for this at this point in time. As for the article you referred to, a Facebook publication, frankly, I'm not aware of it. We will peruse it, and if there would be a need to interfere, will consider. Let me take this with a pinch of salt, that it is possible in the Republic of Armenia for any bank not to return the deposits of the people. Mr. Moldusyan. Thank you, Mr. Galstyan. Several questions. During the previous press conference, a question was asked whether disconnecting Russia from SWIFT will have any consequences. You said brief and grave, without spelling it out. Now, the majority of Russian banks are 70% are under sanctions, and the same amount are disconnected from SWIFT. There are certain banks that still are connected. So most of Armenian banks are connected with the external world through Russian banks. What are the issues that Armenian banks encounter in this respect, whether they have it or not? If I'm not mistaken, you mentioned that VTB Bank is in the sanctions list. You didn't name it, but still. They have an issue with Visa cards, if I'm not mistaken. There was a publication with respect to the Terut mine, which also have a problem, because this is the bank that disposes of it. So the question is, let me not say jeopardized, but will the Russians' investments in Armenia suffer as a result, and how will the Armenian economy overall bear the impact? Because there are major systemic enterprises in Armenia with Russian investment, with the rail, Southern Railway, Armenal, and you name it. What are the expectations of the central bank in this respect? And the last question: foreign nationals, in particular Russian citizens that move to Armenia, have an issue with setting up bank accounts. They approach the banks, they are on waiting list, turned down more often than not. What is the reason? Is this because of the sanctions? About the SWIFT system, during our previous press conference, I said grave, but we've done some work in the meantime, expecting certain developments, and I believe it was right that we were proactive here. At this point, luckily, the banking system of the Republic of Armenia has no issues with external payments. Both our banks and ourselves are actively working in setting up corresponding account relations with new banks to serve the businesses as well as possible. As for specifically VTB Bank, we have circulated a press release, and we state there in the umpteenth time that the bank is pretty healthy, is under constant supervision by the central bank. There are some momentary issues with the bank's cards. They are exogenous, outside of our control, but in any case, we have attempting to find certain solutions together with the bank with this respect as well, and shortly these solutions shall be put in place. As for major investments, I can say that by the end of the day, at this point in time, according to information I have access to, many companies that have major investments in Armenia continue to operate normally. Majority of them in the energy sector or the Southern Railway, according to the information that we have, do not operate in the context of sanctions in the Republic of Armenia. They may be deprived of technologies. Well, we keep the finger on the pulse of the development. 5.3 down to 1.6 reduction of the economic growth forecast is determined by the fact that, according to our estimates, hold on, I'll bring up the chart. You see the decline in the Russian economy. Our estimate is about 6%. The red line in the right-hand side, so it does impact us significantly. So excluding that, the Russian signals will not affect us, would be stretching it, but we have to calmly work to maximally minimize the impact on our economy. And what was the third question? Russian citizens setting up accounts here in Armenia. In any banking system, even irrespective of the sanctions on this conflict, the requirements for non-residents are more rigid than those for residents. In this situation, the approach of the banks is pretty conservative and appropriate, if you want my opinion, because the banks onboard new clients through due process, which means essentially the banks do the due diligence of their new clients, trying as a rule to understand whether these are transit customers or the center of their economic interest would be in Armenia. If it's the second option, that is, the clients are included, onboarded into the Armenian banking system because their economic center of interest moves to Armenia, then there is no issue. If the bank estimates that the Armenian banking system shall be used as a transit hub for transactions, then of course the banks respond upon their discretion. At this point, if I'm not mistaken, 6,500 non-residents have already entered the Armenian banking system. I had a private meeting over what period? Within the last 2 weeks, since March 2 to this day. Let me tell you of a private situation. A major international company's head I had a meeting with, who set up an account in one of our banks right on the eve of our meeting, and the person assured me that such service had yet to be encountered by him. He has worked in many countries of the world and never encountered such high level of service. So when you mentioned one side of the story, we have to acknowledge that we have high quality services as well. Arm info. I apologize, I will speak in Russian. What will the development be? We know that most of the funds arrive here from Russia. What are your estimates about that? And the second question about the raising the refinancing rate. Last year the lending has slowed down. Don't you think that increasing the refinancing rate will exacerbate the situation with lending? But I will answer in Armenian anyway. As for the remittances, according to our estimates, through this year we will have a certain decline in remittances, very preliminarily about 20% of a decline in remittances. As for volume of lending in view of increased refinancing rate, the biggest factor that affects lending is the total uncertainty, if you want my opinion. Once we get out of this stage, and for businesses and banks, development prospects will become more certain, the conflict unfolding, the economy developing, then I believe the central bank's refinancing rate increase, which will contribute to regulating the inflationary environment in the country, will be viewed by investors as a far more positive step. People will invest based on our macroeconomic policy. Civic AM. Mr. Galstyan, since the board of CBA has decided to increase by 1.25 percentage points the refinancing rate, will this contribute to possibly expected restriction of price hikes, or will it impact the already more expensive prices? And since you mentioned that the positive impact is expected in the tourism, some economists still deny that there will be positive trends in the tourism. Could you expand on it? Thank you. With your permission, I will answer somewhat in retrospect. You may recall that throughout 2020, when in the Republic of Armenia in December, inflation was 1.6, the central bank increased by 1% percentage point the refinancing rate, because in our assessment we were expecting that in the Republic of Armenia there will be an inflationary environment through 21. Through you, we clearly communicated this message to the public that 21 will be inflationary. The central bank, with its toolkit, contributed to the midterm inflation returning to the target. Over a year, the inflation grew. In December of 21, it already reached 9.6%. 9.6. In December, it went down to 7.7. In February, we already had 6.5% of an inflation, which means that we did our work well in managing inflationary expectations and inflation. As of end of February, had it not been for this conflict and its ancillary inflationary phenomena, and we're responding to this anyway, had we ruled all this out, we would see that Armenia is in the team of exceptional countries where inflation in the month of February had a trend of reduction. Starting end of the year, the inflation was going down, which is something we communicated about. And our expectation from the perspective of our policy was that by the end of 22 we should have gotten close to our target. Since we now have what we have, we naturally cannot remain impartial, because these developments will impact the inflationary background and expectations. At this point in time, we decided to focus all of our actions on the future. We do not respond to the current situations. What we do today is aiming at restraining future inflation. Continuing with this idea, let me add one more thing. There is another important factor that affected the decision. It's the risk premium increase. I will try to show it on the chart. On the left-hand side, the sovereign risk premium. Before the conflict, it was about 300 basis points. At this point, not only ours, but almost in every country in the region, it went up to 600 basis points. In late terms, it means investors, in order to invest in this jurisdiction, will ask for 300 additional basis points, 3% additional return on investment. This affects our neutral interest rate, and through the neutral interest rate we have to specifically respond and cover that which the markets expect from us. All of our actions are aiming at the future and not respond to the present. Could you remind? Yes, tourism. In our estimates, through this year there will be certain rebound of tourism because of several factors. One factor is the mitigation of the COVID situation. Scenario development, considering the uncertainty, could be diverse, also depending on the course of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. There may be different incarnations. We expect that we'll have certain increase over last year's indicators in tourism. What's the difference? No mic, no translation. Please turn on your mic. Is it a growth on the background of a negative? Do you mean we will reach the indicators of 2019? No. But we expect more than in 21, yes. In 21, we also have reiterated, and our de facto indicators have demonstrated that we had a rebound more than expected in tourism through 21. This year, we expect this to continue by the same token. Like the governor mentioned, there could be different scenarios, much more positives and far more negatives, less likely so. Let me fill in about the remittances. I apologize. We expect 20% decline in the remittances, but we need to evaluate the economic fallout so that we do not overestimate this or not take it as in the past. We already mentioned that the overall economic effect of remittances have reduced and have less weight in the GDP, and especially the share of remittances from Russia has shrunk anyway. In the past, give or take, the remittances were 10-15% in the GDP. Now it's 7-8%, and the weight of Russian remittances in the past was 80. Now it's 40% in the total. This means that this transfer channel has reduced on the effect of our economy. Does FATF add new requirements in view on verifying transactions with Russia or processing transactions with Russia? Does it add time or costs to the banks? And as for foreign trade difficulties in crises like this, as it happened in 2020, public support is steered towards short-term liquidity, assurance of the enterprises. They get working capital augmentation to maintain incessant operations. Is there any discussion underway with the government in order to release such funding to the businesses like it was done under certain projects in 2020? As for legal persons and business deposits, if I'm not mistaken, even before this Russian-Ukrainian conflict, the enterprises increase their deposits. Do you think this will continue according to your analysis, or is there a risk that, especially in this uncertainty, the businesses shall no longer invest their working capital in business, but simply keep them in the banks outside of the economy? And one more question, with your permission. Apart from this situation, refinance rate increase is expected in the USA, and the Fed will have a session today. Is it possible, in view of such an increase, there will be an outflow of non-resident deposits who keep forex deposits in our banks? If yes, what could be the consequences? Thank you for a multifaceted. Let's start with FATF. According to information I have access to, no standard or anything else has changed. As for the second question about foreign trade enterprises and possible support programs, these discussions, I believe, are underway, but they will follow the analysis you referred to in your first question. This will not be ubiquitous like it was during the pandemic. It will be more targeted, addressing the companies that may possibly suffer as a result of Russian-Ukrainian conflict as exporters, or whether the businesses will keep their funds in the banks without new investment projects. That's quite possible a scenario, because essentially business likes peace and tranquility rather than uncertainty. So I would not even venture to say something on behalf of businesses. And last but not least, the Fed increasing the rate possibly, and the response there too. The most probable scenario will be 0.26% increase today. We already increased by 1.25. So when I was telling you about the risk premium, as a rule, whenever such an unrest takes place where there arises what they call flight to quality, we do expect this as, I wouldn't say that we're expecting this as an extreme possible risk. We believe that investors that are in this region, and particularly in Armenia, are pretty well compensated against the risks that they assume. The returns are sufficient for them to feel compensated against the risks they assume in investing in Armenia. Therefore, we do not expect major flight of capital out of Armenia. Let me add here, as the government mentioned in our program and our decisions, regardless, we factor in all of these factors, including the increase in US refinancing rate. All ancillary consequences are already included in our projections. And let me emphasize one more thing. It's very important in this background to look at the degree of trust and confidence of the investors in the banking financial systems of countries, and that's a reputation of their monetary and fiscal policies. So when Mr. Galstyan told you how we responded to the inflation, this story has been commended by whoever is looking at our macroeconomic stability. So in the context of these discussions, they should be looked at as a serious factor, not considering all countries equal in this respect. CBA net. Mr. Galstyan, a question is in a geopolitical context because of the situation. When they ask international players or major politicians, they all say that after this conflict, the world will no longer be the same as before. What are the expectations in the financial world? Will there be global shifts, or what if? Some people speak about the new Iron Curtain. What will be the global major impact on the financial world, and if yes, what? A premise that is actively circulating with respect to the financial world is as follows. An unprecedented step was taken. The reserves of a major country like Russia were frozen, essentially. If you look, the financial experts are asking this question, whether assets in US dollars or the US dollars will not continue to be viewed by other countries as the most safe and secure place to keep their assets. I believe the tectonic shifts in the financial system will not happen, yet the new trends emerging in the financial system will pertain rather than to geopolitical developments, they will rather be focusing on digitization, comfort. As for the possible impact of geopolitical developments on the financial systems, I believe we'll have to live and see as to what will transpire, especially at least after the end of the active phase of this confrontation. The public is interested in the following. The margin between the buy and sell is now 20% for rubles, 10% for dollars. Is it this volatility associated risk, or the banks are just doing business? There has not been such volatility in rubles up to 1 dram. I don't want to compare it with the supply demand. Is it just
Ըստ էության
going after profits, or is it evaluating the risks? The balance between buy and sell of forex in the Republic of Armenia usually is very moderate and small, this margin in Armenia. So to assume that this is the abuse of market position in this situation would not be appropriate. As for the spread of this margin, we have to understand that it would be very difficult to understand at this point. Find a single exchange rate in Russia. At this point in the financial market, there are lots of discussions, various exchange rates at the exchanges for cash, non-cash transactions, which of course troubles financial agents, including banks. They are trying to hedge their potential risks in as much as possible to restrain volatility without having adequate toolkits to trade in derivatives or other instruments with Russia. The only possibility they have is to have a larger spread than historically it was in place. We all understand that in these conditions of uncertainty and volatility, if the spread is low, you acquire an asset at X valuation. Over a single day it could fall 20% and you incur losses. So the financial agents, I think, take these decisions based on the rationale I mentioned. As for the position of the central bank, we think that the market shall regulate this itself. Doing it through imperative regulation will result in far worse consequences like the black market. So reflecting the market pricing is still a priority. Concurrent with reduced risks, the situation will fix itself. As for the ruble spread, whenever the buy and sell spread of an asset widens like this means there is uncertainty about its price. As Mr. Galstyan mentioned, at this point in Russia, there is quite a lot of uncertainty about cash non-cash pricing of ruble and big spreads. Being the source of shocks, Russia, you cannot expect that Armenia will have smaller spreads than in Russia itself. It's the reflection of the same uncertainty in the Republic of Armenia rather than the decision by economic agents here in Armenia. A question was already asked about the possible risk of flight of forex. You mentioned that you do not see a need to take specific steps about this, but you mentioned that the banks have already done certain things. What is it that the banks did? What did you refer to? What are the banks doing now? And about Ukrainian call about mirror cards, what's the central bank position on this? There is this artificial noise, which I do not see the need of about mirror cards. The central bank continues its regular operations. As for your first question as to what the banks are doing and what's the position of the central bank, we think that there is no need to apply administrative leverage at this point. The banks, if I'm not mistaken, a week after the hostilities broke out, the banks decided to restrict the possibility of cashing in non-resident cards, which was removed, if I'm not mistaken, this restriction. And a decision was taken also about if Russian non-residents were opening accounts to somehow control the influx of rubles. They were concerned that there could be an influx of rubles to Armenia, be converted into cash forex, and then flee Armenia. But I think the banks were quite reasonable and balanced in their response to this. Today's situation is such that we do not do several days of forecast, we do it on a daily basis. The uncertainty is such that we need to do it on a daily, hourly basis, follow the developments.
Եթե կարելի է իհարկե դրամավարկային քաղաքականությունը նվիրված հանդիպումը, բայց ունենք
This is on monetary policy, but a fiscal question nevertheless, a risk assessment, if you will find it appropriate. Budget, revenue collection or shortfall, do you see any risks? You mentioned about 6,500 non-resident accounts were opened within the last 2 weeks or 10 days. Since March 2. As for fiscal accounts, in our baseline scenario, we include information we have access to. We remain within the fiscal framework that the government has prescribed. As for future developments, what would be the fiscal response? We already have agreed today with the Ministry of Finance and their colleagues in the government to sit down together and discuss this. At this point in time, I would not be able to share anything else with you. With your permission, you shifted the accent to fiscal risks in the budget program for 22. There is 70 billion drams additional buffer expenditures envisaged, which the government has set aside for unprecedented situation. We think that this scenario fully fits within this provision. As for the discussion with the partners in the government, Mr. Galstyan already mentioned. So rethinking the expenditures with respect to these risks and having additional effects on the economy, these are issues that are not on the agenda today. Did you refer to the reserve fund? 67 billion. When I mentioned that the fiscal policy assumptions have not changed, to illustrate it with an example, you said that during coronavirus there were support projects and programs, and you asked whether producers may expect something similar this time. Our main message is that in this 1.6% that is not reflected because we still do not have information as to what will transpire. It's highly likely that the government will adjust fiscal monetary policies. If there is incentives, that will be reflected in the GDP projections. This is quite possible, naturally, not only possible, but likely. For clarity's sake, today's increase in refinancing is aiming at the future. On the background of this negative geopolitical external signals, is it possible that in the near future the central bank will revert to increasing the refinancing rate once again? In the press release that I read out for you that is covered, let me reiterate that it's not the geopolitical situation that may determine it, but if we see that in order to get to our inflation target that will be required, we'll go for it.
Մի հատ շեշտադրում եմ ուզում ավելացնել,
Let me add an emphasis about being focused on the future. Our today's determination of the rate, and we communicated the same way in December 2020. We always balance our policy. Since we reviewed down the GDP estimates and expect a slowdown, this is also reflected in the interest rate. When the governor referred to the neutral rate, what matters here is that through our actions we of course see that the risks have increased and the inflation background will be higher. We shall not accelerate inflation through our actions in Armenia. Our monetary position is neutralized, not to accelerate it. This balancing between the demand and the inflation is done, all things considered. Concurrently with increased dollar exchange rate, certain banks propose to their clients, if they cash out more than 10,000 US, to inform them a week in advance, failing that they won't be able to do it. Reputable people in social media circulate ideas that lots of dollars have fled from the central bank to Russia, and the increase in the exchange rate is determined by that. Do we expect shortage of dollars in Armenia? What do these people say? They claim that lots of dollars have fled from the central banks to the Russian Federation, and the increased exchange rate is caused by that. Through no channel has any dollar left central bank for Russia. We have our balance, everything is accounted for. We do not have one system of accounting to bring it in and another system of accounting to take it out. This belongs to the genre of the absurd. As for the cash out and exchange rate, of course, alongside this tension, people and business entities have this desire to move from non-cash to cash means. So the question is whose cash is? If it's the dirhams of the Republic of Armenia, therefore essentially owned by the central bank, no issue there whatsoever. But we understand that it's the Federal Reserve System that owns the dollars, therefore that imposes certain restrictions in this situation in circulation or release of cash dollars. Nevertheless, to the tribute of our financial system, I shall acknowledge that our banks and the central bank have enough of cash reserves. And since in my previous statements I mentioned that at this point in time we do not see the need for any regulatory interference, the cash exists in the volume and amount which we consider to be adequate to the situation. So this concern in our vision will decrease alongside the developments of the situation. Mr. Galstyan, you mentioned about exporters that may encounter issues in view of the decline of the Russian economy. There is a lot of discussion about diversifying exports. Foreign trade relations of Armenia have been hinged to one or two dimensions, whereas sanctions against Russia, we understand that they're not short-term, there may be long-term essentially. So in this respect, what does the central bank or the Armenian authorities have to do to diversify exports, and can it be done considering the goods we're exporting to Russia? This is the turf of the government and the Ministry of Economy. Let me refrain from answering because this is beyond our turf.
Պարոն Գալստյան, կենտրոնական բանկը ինտերվենցիաներ կատարում է,
Does the central bank intervene to stabilize the exchange rate? If yes, in what volumes starting March?
Ես էլի ենթատեքստով ու թվերով կամ ինչ որ տրամաբանված փորձեմ ձեր
I'll try to answer using numbers. We didn't intervene. For starters, let me tell you why. I believe we have excellent public, not just good but excellent people who have been capable over years to learn and have proven through their behavior that they are reasonable and are on top of the situation. Let me expand further. You may remember that through 2020, when we were at war and in the wake thereof certain outflow of financial means took place. During our meetings back then, I was intensively advising people not to remove their funds, not to break their deposits because of 5-10% of changing the forex, not to damage their finances. The significant part of the society listened to this, especially small depositors who were saving in drums. They did not make any uncontrolled movements. Getting back to the current situation, when the forex also devalued significantly this time, we noticed that the number, the volume of such uncontrolled movement was far less than even previous times, which comes to prove that people have hearkened to everything we have to convey to them. There is trust towards the central bank, which is what we appreciate, but they've also learned the ropes from the past experience we've been through together. One more clarifying question: is there any data about the increase of card transactions since lots of Russian citizens arrived in Armenia? Yes, we have this data on a daily basis. We take it from the archive system. There is a significant increase, but I cannot pin it down. We have days when it was triple the average daily number of transactions by payment cards of non-residents. Other questions? So you have not observed any impulse dollar acquisitions or wires, far less than in the past we have noticed. Or you may recall that 4 or 5 years ago, whenever there was 20 drums devaluation of drum, everyone was focusing on 20 drums devaluation of the forex, whereas we had twice more of a devaluation of the exchange rate, and I cannot claim that the natural persons who are the most sensitive to this, we can't claim they change their behavior. People are calmly on top of the situation and they've taken their decisions respectively. Other questions? Thank you.